I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
They spent decades earning your trust. Every morning or every evening, they looked into a camera and millions of people believed what they said. Then, almost overnight, the chair was empty and someone else was sitting in it. No goodbye tour. No retirement party. Just gone. What happened to them after the cameras stopped rolling is stranger, sadder, and in some cases more redemptive than anyone expected. Today we're looking at the news anchors who lost the biggest platforms in American television, and where life actually took them once the spotlight moved on. Let's start with someone whose downfall had almost nothing to do with anything she did. Ann Curry joined NBC News in the late 1990s and spent close to 15 years building one of the most respected resumes in the building. She covered wars, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises with a kind of seriousness that made her stand out from the typical morning show personality. By 2011, that reputation earned her the co-host chair on the Today Show, sitting next to Matt Lauer in one of the most watched seats in morning television. It did not last. Within a year, NBC pulled her from the role, and the way it happened became a story in itself. Reports at the time suggested the decision had less to do with her work and more to do with tension behind the scenes, including friction with her co-host that network executives apparently decided to resolve by removing her instead of him. Her final segment on air was emotional enough that clips of it still circulate online more than a decade later. NBC kept her on as a correspondent, but the assignments never matched what she'd had before, and she left the network entirely a few years later. Since then, she's hosted documentary projects, including a series for PBS centered on reuniting people separated by historical events, and another health-focused series for cable television. She has said in interviews that she'd still consider returning to a daily anchor role if the right opportunity came along. As of now, that hasn't happened. What makes her story different from most of the others on this list is that she didn't make a mistake. She was simply on the losing end of an internal power struggle, and the 15 years she'd put into her career absorbed the cost of that struggle. Then there's the anchor whose fall came from a story about himself. Brian Williams took over NBC Nightly News in 2004, stepping into a chair that had belonged to Tom Brokaw for almost a quarter century. Somehow he made it work, and for years his broadcast was the most watched evening news program in the country. He had the kind of dry, confident delivery that made him feel like the most trustworthy person in the room. Then, in February 2015, a story he'd told multiple times over the years started to fall apart. Williams had long described being aboard a helicopter that came under fire during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Soldiers who were actually on that mission pushed back hard, saying the aircraft Williams had been on wasn't the one that took fire. He'd arrived later, on a different helicopter. Williams retracted the claim, but the damage didn't stop there. NBC's internal review, conducted while he was suspended without pay for 6 months, also turned up inconsistencies in how he described his reporting during Hurricane Katrina. He never got the anchor chair back. Instead, NBC shifted him to MSNBC, where he hosted a late-night program until his contract ran out in late 2021. Since leaving the network, he stayed surprisingly active for someone written off as finished. He's a longtime volunteer firefighter in New Jersey, a role he's held seriously rather than for publicity. He anchored an election night broadcast for Amazon Prime in 2024 that actually won him an Emmy. And in April 2026, Netflix announced he'd be hosting a new weekly interview podcast called We're Back, with Brian Williams, featuring conversations with actors, musicians, and other public figures. The fact that a major streamer was willing to build a show around him more than a decade after his fall says something about how differently audiences can treat a credibility scandal once enough time has passed, especially when the original offense was exaggeration rather than malice. Matt Lauer's story sits at the opposite end of that spectrum. He hosted the Today Show from 1997 to 2017, 2 decades that made him one of the most familiar faces in American morning television. Then, in November 2017, NBC fired him within a day of receiving a formal complaint from a colleague about his conduct. The announcement went out early in the morning, and his own co-anchors had to break the news live, on the same set he'd anchored for years. More accounts from other women followed in the days after, and the details that emerged were serious enough that NBC never wavered on the decision. Lauer has maintained that the relationships in question were consensual, But the broader picture described by multiple women went well beyond that defense. For nearly 2 years, he essentially disappeared from public view, reportedly living quietly on Long Island, away from the social circles he'd been part of for decades. By the early 2020s, reports suggested his personal life had settled somewhat. He'd reportedly rebuilt a relationship with his children and maintained a workable relationship with his ex-wife, and has been linked to a property he owns in New Zealand. What hasn't returned is any version of his career. He hasn't appeared on television, launched a media project, or made any visible attempt at a comeback. Of everyone on this list, his is probably the most complete professional disappearance, and given what came out about his conduct, it's not the kind of disappearance most viewers have spent much time missing. Charlie Rose followed a similar trajectory. For more than 2 decades, his late-night interview program on PBS was considered one of the most substantive conversation shows on American television, the kind of place where major figures in politics, business, and culture sat down for real, unhurried discussions. He also co-anchored CBS This Morning, giving him a mainstream audience on top of his public broadcasting reputation. In November 2017, The Washington Post published an investigation in which 8 women described inappropriate conduct by Rose, ranging from unwanted touching to more serious behavior. Within days, CBS, PBS, and Bloomberg all ended their relationships with him. As the story spread, more women came forward, eventually pushing the total number of accusers past 30. Rose acknowledged that some accounts were accurate while disputing others, framing what happened as consensual from his perspective. But the response from the industry was swift and total. His programs were canceled, his contracts terminated, and a reputation built over decades was effectively erased within weeks. Reports from the following year described him living quietly on Long Island, filling his time with fishing and tennis while avoiding contact with people who'd once been friendly with him. His occasionally posted interviews on his own website, including a notable sit-down with Warren Buffett in 2022. But none of it comes close to the reach he had with major network backing. No television network has brought him back in any form, and his case stands out for how thoroughly and permanently it ended a career that had taken decades to build. Not every story on this list involves misconduct allegations. Steve Kometko spent close to a decade as one of the most recognizable faces on E! News, interviewing major celebrities from 1994 through 2002 with a warmth that came across as genuine rather than performative. His exit had nothing to do with how he covered the entertainment industry. While renegotiating his contract, he posted something on his personal website asking fans to write to the network in support of him. When he asked whether he'd used a company computer to make that post, he said no, he had. When the network found out, they used the lie as grounds to fire him. Kometko has said in interviews that he didn't fully grasp what was happening at the time, and that the speed of it still feels disorienting looking back. What followed was worse than the firing itself. He tried to find other television work, and kept running into the same answer. He was too closely tied to E! For competing networks to want him. The identity that had defined his career for nearly a decade became the exact thing blocking him from working anywhere else. He eventually left Los Angeles for Chicago to help care for his aging parents and took a retail job at an Apple store. He's spoken candidly about turning to alcohol during that stretch, describing years of heavy drinking before getting sober around 2016. The Chicago years meant starting over in a city where nobody recognized him, working alongside people who had no idea he'd once interviewed some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Since getting sober, he's built a podcast called Still Here Hollywood, where he talks with people connected to the entertainment world, and has been open about the drinking and the years that led to it. His audience now is a fraction of what he had at his peak, but his story is one of the more quietly painful ones here, because the original offense was so small compared to what it cost him. Terry Moran's exit happened almost overnight, and the reasoning behind it has been debated ever since. He'd spent nearly 3 decades at ABC News, working as a White House correspondent, a foreign correspondent, and an anchor of Nightline, and by 2025 he was considered one of the network's most experienced political journalists. In June of that year, he posted a message on social media late at night that strongly criticized a senior White House official and the president, using language that went well beyond the tone ABC expects from its reporters. The network suspended him almost immediately, and within days announced it would not renew his contract, calling the post a clear violation of its editorial standards. Moran later pushed back on the idea that alcohol had anything to do with it, saying directly that it wasn't a drunk tweet, and that he stood behind what he'd written, even as he acknowledged the language itself had been more aggressive than he'd normally use. That stance was unusual. Most journalists in his position try to walk back the moment with a careful apology aimed at preserving whatever relationships are still salvageable. Moran didn't do that, and while it closed some doors, his defenders pointed to it as proof that his journalism had always come from genuine conviction rather than institutional caution. Since leaving ABC, he's built a newsletter on Substack focused on political commentary, which has attracted well over 100,000 subscribers, a meaningful audience by newsletter standards but nowhere near the millions who used to see him on network television. He hasn't returned to broadcast news in any capacity. Brooke Baldwin's story shows how differently these exits can look from the outside compared to what's actually happening behind the scenes. She joined CNN in 2008 and spent 13 years as one of the network's steadiest daytime anchors. In February 2021, she announced on air that she was leaving the network, and at the time it was framed entirely as her own decision to move on to other things. 3 years later, in a 2024 essay for Vanity Fair, she revealed that wasn't the full story. She'd actually been let go. According to her account, the trouble began after she relocated from Atlanta to New York, while her executive producer stayed behind, and she said his behavior toward her changed for the worse after that. She asked for a different producer, a request she described as fairly standard in the industry, and it was denied. She was pulled off air for 2 months, and by January 2021 she'd been let go entirely. She's explained that she waited 3 years to tell the real story because she was still processing what had happened and because the legal and professional complications made it difficult to speak freely right away. When she finally did write about it, the distance gave her account a level of detail and credibility that an immediate statement likely wouldn't have had. Since leaving CNN, she hasn't returned to mainstream broadcast journalism. She now hosts a podcast and describes herself as self-employed, and while that's a real career, it's not the same platform she spent 13 years building. Taken together, these stories don't really fit one tidy lesson. And Curry lost her seat to office politics and never fully got an equivalent one back. Brian Williams lost his for stretching the truth about himself and, somehow, found his way to a second act on a major streaming platform. Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose lost everything because of how they treated the people around them, and neither has been welcomed back in any form. Steve Kometko lost a decade over a small lie that spiraled into years of personal struggle before he rebuilt something quieter and more honest. Terry Moran lost a TV anchor desk for refusing to take back something he said, and Brooke Baldwin spent years staying silent about a story that wasn't his to control. What connects them is just how fast it can all dissipate, and how little warning most of them got before the chair was someone else's. If you found this rundown interesting, let us know which one of these stories surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the people behind the headlines, stick around, because there's plenty more where this came from.